The last part of chapter 4 here starts by talking about Linux file permissions. And so what we did in the last class period is we talked about how to change ownership and change the group for a file, or that works with directories as well. But there was when we did a long listing of files, and you can do this if you're in your home directory just by doing an ls-l. You can see that we've got this sort of mysterious RWX sort of stuff here. And really, what we know about this so far is that if we had something that was a symbolic link, we know that this first thing right here, the first field was an L. And if you want to go ahead and create a symbolic link again and then do a long listing of it to prove that to yourself, you're more than welcome to do that. And probably some of you that are observant, and I don't think I've said this, but you may have figured it out on your own, is that if something's a directory, it's going to actually give you a D here. If it's just a normal file, you get something that's called a tick mark. Well, you just get a dash or a tack or a tick mark or whatever you want to call it here. It doesn't really designate anything other than it's just a normal file. And then we have this series of R's and W's and dashes, or here it's an R and W and an X. Well, what does this mean? Figuring out how to read this and kind of how to understand what it means is probably one of the things in Linux that separates people that are just learning it from people that are a little bit more experienced. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what those mean and how to change them. What that represents, what that RWX means, is the permissions that the file has. And so if you're looking at this, you can see that you've got something that looks like RWX and then an RWX and then an RWX. This isn't a command, by the way. I'm just kind of demonstrating how this is. There's no spaces in there, but this is pretty much what it means. There's three groups of R's and W's and X's, right? And they designate three different things. The first RWX that you're going to see is the permission level for the person who's the user of the file. The second RWX is going to be the permission level for the people that are the group, and now you know where it's important that we were talking about groups. And then the third RWX is kind of just everybody else that's on the system that is not the user and is not in that default group. So that's referred to as other. It basically just means sort of everybody, but everybody meaning everybody that can log onto the system. If you can't get onto the system at all, you obviously don't have permissions to take a look at any of the files. So the first RWX here sort of explains what it means for the user. And so what does the R and W and X mean? Well, if there's an R there, it means that that person or that entity, in this case for the first RWX, it's the user, has permission to read the file. If there's a W, it means that they have permission to write to the file. And if if there's an X there, it means that they have permission to execute the file. Now, reading the file should be pretty straightforward. If you cat out a file and it tells you that and it gives you a result, shows you the file, then you had read permission for that file. And that may be something that we want, say, all users to have for a particular file. So we would turn on R for all of the users. If we want users to be able to modify the file, then we would give them write access to it. So there may be some files that you open in Linux that you can see those files, but you actually can't change them. That's probably because you have read access, but you don't have write access. Now, the executable sort of permissions are going to be if you're actually trying to run something on the system. And this gets a little bit more interesting when we talk about scripting in Linux, because we might want to write our own scripts, and if we want somebody to be able to run that script as if it's a little program, we would give them permission to execute that file. So if you want to see what this looks like, if you take one of the commands that we were using earlier, for example vi, and you say which vi, you can see that this actually points to this thing right here. So if I do a long listing ls-l on user bin vim, you can see that this has an execute for everybody. Everybody on the system is allowed to run vi. And just as sort of a generalization, doesn't happen on all Linux distributions, but it does happen on a great many of them. If something is executable, you're going to see that it is listed in green. Typically, that means that something has permission to be executable. So you can see that right here, the person who's the user, which is root, can execute VI. The person that's in the root group can execute VI, and then somebody who is not either anybody else in the system that has access to the system, including people like me. I'm not in the root group and I'm not the root user. I can still use VI too. So it lets us do that. So that's what those modes mean. Now, what I've just described is what they mean when we're talking about a file. If you're talking about if somebody has read permission, they can open and read the file. If they have write permission, they can actually open, read it, and then edit it. And then if we're talking about executable, the idea of executing something, we can talk about running it as if it's a program. For a text file, for a normal text file, it doesn't necessarily make sense to have executable permissions on it because it doesn't run. It's not a program. And as I imagine that you can just think about, if you have a file that you could read to but you can't, or that you could write to but you can't read it, that doesn't make a lot of sense either. So generally, if we're going to give somebody write permission, we're going to make sure that they have read permission as well. That's having to do with files, but you can do the same thing with directories. And you can see here that we've got a directory right here. Well, what do those mean when we're talking about a directory? If somebody has read permission to a directory, it means that they can list the contents of that directory. They can look inside it and see what's going on. If they've been given both read and execute permission. If they have write permission to a directory, it means they can add and remove files in there. And then execute is typically used in conjunction with read to give somebody permission to work with the contents of the directory. This is all on page 171. If you want to make reference to this, you don't have to write that all down. But what I want to that's so the read and write mean a little bit sort of different things if we're talking about folders or directories. A lot of times we're not necessarily going to write to a folder. When we talk about writing to a folder, we're not talking about writing to that folder, but we're talking about writing to the files that are showing up inside that folder. So that's how you read the RWX, RWX, RWX. So I'm going to go ahead and say touch test file, and then do a long listing on test file. And you can see that by default, and we'll talk about how to change these defaults in a little bit, what this does is this gives read-write permission to the user, read-write permission to the group, and then read permission to everybody else. So I think you should be able to look at these and sort of understand what those mean. What if we want to change them? What if this is a private file and I don't want anybody to be able to read this? I don't want anybody to write to this even if they're in my group. Well, one of the things that I can do, the easiest way to think about modifying that is if I look at this file, I can say chmod. And this is the command to change permissions, modified permissions on a file, chmod, and then I'm going to specify the thing that I want to change the permissions for, and let's say I want to change the permissions for the group, so I'm going to type a G. Then if I want to take away the write permissions for that, I'm going to type minus W for write, and then I'm going to give it the name of the file. And if I do that and then go ahead and list that out again, you can see that we've actually changed the permissions here. We previously had permission to write to this if we were in the group. Now we don't. Well, what if I want everybody to be able to write to it? Well, what I could do is if I just say chmod and then say plus W without specifying that it's the user or the group or the other, what's that going to do? Well, that should actually give us well, it gives us this back. It doesn't actually give it back for the other person. But if I wanted to put that in there, I should be able to do something like this, and then it's going to give me that for everything else. So you can do a lot of these in this sort of the same command. So I could do something like chmod group minus write other minus write other plus execute test file. And then if we did something like this, you can see that what we've done is we've taken away write access for this, and we've given executable access to everybody on the system. So it's actually showing up in green now. That's great. I don't actually want to make this an executable file, so I'm going to go chmod o-x test file. So what I want you to see is that there are a couple different ways that we can use chmod. This is a way of using chmod where I'm adding and subtracting permissions based on the way that it was set up before, and I'm looking at those and then making changes. There's another way that I can just sort of set things from the ground up. If I say something like chmod and then I say user equals rwx owner or other, sorry, group equals rw other equals read or something like that. And if I do something like this, you can see that what it does is it changes the permissions to what I've listed here, regardless of where the file started out. So if we're doing something with equal signs here, what I'm actually doing is setting those permissions. Not really based on where it was, but I'm not changing them from the state that it was until some sort of modification. I'm actually just saying this is what I want them to be. So the end result can be the same, but the difference is if you're doing something like this, what it's going to do is only modify the permissions that you specify. If you do something like this, it's going to modify everything at the same time. So there's a couple different ways to use chmod, and this is probably the one that's the easiest for most students to understand. Now, one of the things that I'm going to say, I say this in Linux 2 all the time, and I'll probably say it more in this class as it goes on, is this idea that a lot of times in Linux you have multiple ways to do something. And one of the things that makes this class more challenging than it would be otherwise is I can't just show you guys the way that I think is the easiest way to do it. Well, I mean, I can do that, and I actually do that. This is probably the easiest way to use chmod. But there are a lot of different ways that you can use chmod. We've seen two of them here, either using the equal sign or using plus or minus. And you need to be familiar with all of these ways if you're taking the Linux Plus test, because there's not necessarily they're gonna expect you to be familiar with all the ways that you can use chmod, even if you're only used to using one of those ways if you're actually doing something in Linux in real life. So the next thing that I want to talk about is how to use chmod numerically, and that's going to be something for the next video. But this gets us through around page 173. We'll talk a little bit more about chmod, and then we'll keep going with this chapter.